Dark clouds roiled over the distant hills, their thunderous growls echoing across the open fields. Rain hammered the rusted roof of an old wooden shed, turning gravel paths to muddy streams. The wind whipped fierce and cold, carrying the scent of damp soil and wet grass. Farmer Josiah Parker rushed outside, lantern raised high to pierce the gloom, when he spotted a sight that made his heart pound. A drenched mother bear, her thick fur plastered to her side, and 3 quivering cubs, all seeking refuge from the relentless storm. Unaware of the boundary between wild and human domain, they begged for a single, unthinkable favor. Josiah Parker had been farming the rolling acreage of Redwood Hills for most of his 62 years. His father had once labored there before him, and his grandmother had lived in the original homestead through decades of economic booms and busts. With every generation, the Parker family left a piece of themselves in the soil. Long before modern roads connected their fields to the nearest town, they had fished in the nearby creek, grown corn and soybeans, and raised a few cattle and chickens. The land was both heritage and responsibility, an inheritance that weighed on Josiah's broad shoulders. He lived alone, though alone was not the right word for his existence. Each sunrise found him greeting the farm's animals as though they were old friends, his faithful border collie, Buster, the small herd of brown and white spotted dairy cows, and a flock of chickens that wandered around their coop, busy and seemingly oblivious to everything except fresh feed. Josiah's wife, Hannah, had passed away many years prior, taken too soon by an illness that neither the local Redwood Veterinary Clinic, which also sometimes offered help in dire, albeit unusual, human emergencies, nor the traveling nurses could alleviate. Though not a day went by that Josiah didn't think of her. He had grown accustomed to solitude. Even so, there remained a gentle kindness in him, a flicker of warmth that refused to be smothered by grief. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in without mercy. The wind howled against the barn walls, rattling windows and giving the old house an unsettling groan. The forecast had hinted at a strong possibility of high winds and torrential rain, but no one had predicted the skies would open with such unbridled fury. Josiah watched from his front porch as lightning slashed the horizon, illuminating the fields in stark, blinding flashes. The moment the downpour made it impossible to see the barn from his kitchen window, he grabbed his lantern and made his way outdoors. His boots sank into inches of mud. Sheets of rain battered him, soaking his thick plaid shirt in seconds. He had intended to check on the animals, ensure gates were closed, and confirm that the old timber shed by the orchard was secure. That shed had stood for decades, rarely used except for storing worn-out tools or stray bales of hay that didn't fit in the barn. It was a sturdy but ragged structure with flaking paint and a slightly sagging roof. His grandmother used to say that as long as the shed could keep squirrels out, it was still good enough for farm storage. Josiah dreaded a strong wind, pulling the entire rickety building from its foundation. He certainly wasn't expecting visitors there, but on that rain-lashed evening he found an unanticipated scene. The door, swollen from moisture, was ajar, and water pooled at the threshold. Inside, where the lantern's amber glow flickered, stood the silhouette of a large creature. He froze, instincts roaring to life, his breath caught in his throat. A wild bear. Not just any bear, but a mother with 3 small cubs huddled close, their fur slick with rain and their tiny sides heaving in tired, frantic panting. Josiah had encountered bears before. He was not naive to the presence of black bears in Redwood Hills, especially near the orchard where fallen fruit attracted wildlife. Typically, the animals avoided people, preferring deep woods and safe distances. But this mother bear's plight was so dire that she had ventured across farmland and into a human building, an unprecedented move that spoke volumes of her desperation. Thunder crashed, and the cubs pressed tighter against her body. The mother bear's eyes glowed in the lantern light, reflecting a tangled mix of fear, exhaustion, and if one dared to believe it, hope. Josiah's heart lurched. He was no stranger to the sorrow of losing those he loved. Rain trickled down his face, and for a moment, man and beast observed each other in a heavy hush, broken only by the patter of water dripping off the rafters. His instincts told him to be cautious. Wild animals, especially protective mothers, were unpredictable, but he also recognized that her presence in the shed signaled a deep, singular need. She had nowhere else to go, no safe hollow to shelter her babies from the raging storm. Josiah recalled a line from his grandmother's old journal, a note she had scribbled after nursing an injured fox back to health decades earlier. In crisis, compassion must sometimes override fear. So he took a careful step inside. The mother bear lifted her head, her shoulders tensed, and she sniffed the musty air. A low rumble came from her throat, not quite a growl, more a warning that she would protect her cubs if forced. Josiah raised his free hand, palm outward, as if to say he meant no harm. He was not sure if animals recognized gestures in the same way humans did, but he hoped it conveyed his non-threatening intent. The rain hammered the roof like 1,000 hooves. The storm showed no sign of abating, and Josiah realized if the mother bear felt cornered, she might lash out. Nonetheless, something about her weary stance made him think she'd already decided to take a gamble, to trust in the faint possibility that this human might grant them refuge. Carefully, he slid sideways, placing the lantern on a rickety shelf that once held extra nails. The light revealed the mother's trembling flanks and the anxious, wide eyes of her cubs. Each cub was small, perhaps no more than a season old, and drenched to the skin. They likely had not been weaned for very long. One of them sneezed, a pitiful squeak that rose above the roar of the storm. Josiah's heart constricted. With slow, deliberate motions, he peeled off his soaked jacket and gently draped it over the shivering cub. The mother bear watched but did not move, only flicking her ears in a gesture of guarded acceptance. That moment was the beginning. The night wore on, and the storm battered the world outside, but inside that run-down shed, an unlikely scene of compassion took root. Josiah remained watchful, trying to keep a respectful distance, yet still offering small comforts, a dry rag to help wipe away some of the water pooling around the cubs' faces, and eventually some old blankets he had kept in a trunk against the far wall. When dawn broke, ghostly grey light seeped through the cracks in the shed's siding, revealing the mother bear was half asleep, with her head resting on her paws. One cub slept beneath Josiah's jacket, while another was curled on a second blanket. The third was pressed close to her mother's side, eyes tightly shut. Josiah himself nodded off in a rickety chair, arms folded across his chest, until a stray droplet of water fell from the ceiling and woke him. As he stirred, the mother bear raised her head, blinking in the new daylight. Though the rain had mellowed to a drizzle, the storm's aftermath was clear. Puddles dotted the yard, broken branches littered the orchard, and somewhere in the distance, a piece of roofing tin had blown off a shed or barn, clattering in the wind. Slowly, Josiah rose, muscles stiff from the uncomfortable night. The bear regarded him with a level gaze, and somehow, in the quiet exchange that passed between them, he sensed she was acknowledging the trust he had shown her and her offspring. He responded with a gentle nod. Careful not to startle the animals, he stepped outside. Light mist coated his face. He could hear the crowing of his rooster from the chicken coop and, more distantly, the hungry bawling of the cows waiting for their morning feed. For a moment, he allowed himself a silent prayer of thanks that the animals and the house had come through the storm relatively unscathed. The sky was still overcast, but no longer menacing. Daylight came, though tarnished by heavy clouds. Returning to the shed, he noted how the mother bear's eyes flicked anxiously. She was torn, wanting to leave, but uncertain if she and her cubs could handle the journey. The storm might have scattered any foraging opportunities, and the cubs, still trembling from the cold, might not be fit for a long trek back to the safety of the forest. Josiah understood. The question was, what now? Josiah moved slowly around the perimeter of the shed, opening a large crate in the corner. He pulled out a bowl, an old dog dish he had kept stored away after Buster's younger years. With cautious steps, he placed it on the floor near the mother bear, then filled it with water from a container. The mother bear sniffed, hesitated, then ventured to lap from it. Relief flitted across her features, as though she had found a small piece of solace in this strange place. He retrieved some scraps of the leftover bread he kept for the chickens and set them gently beside the water. While he knew bears typically craved berries and fish, any nourishment might help. The mother bear didn't object. She allowed one curious cub to nibble before she too took a bite, though her gaze remained locked on Josiah. If he made a sudden move, she was prepared to defend her young. Unwanted or not, they were now his guests or wards. A wave of responsibility swept through Josiah. He had never tended to wildlife like this. Yet the more he observed the little family, the more he realized they were caught in a precarious position. As if the storm had upended the invisible boundaries of nature, he felt strangely called to help them, or at least ensure they survived the immediate crisis. The morning wore on. Josiah slipped away to handle chores, letting the mother bear have a quiet moment with her young. He made sure Buster was secure in the house, uncertain how the dog would react to the presence of these new neighbors. He fed the chickens, comforted the frightened cows, and cleared fallen branches from the driveway. All the while, he wondered if the mother bear would stay in the shed or move on. When he finally ventured back, armed with an armful of old towels and a little more food, he discovered the bears still there. The three cubs appeared more alert, perked up by the chance to rest. The mother bear met his gaze. This time, there was something almost pleading in her eyes, as if she recognized that this human held the key to ensuring her cubs could face the next few days in safety. It was an unspoken request, startling in its clarity. The unthinkable request, Josiah realized, was that she and her babies remain on his land, dependent on his compassion until they were strong enough to return to the wild. In the days that followed, a new routine emerged in the Parker farm, one unlike any other in Josiah's lifetime. He moved the tractor, his beloved John Deere, purchased second-hand decades ago, out of the main barn, so that the mother bear and her cubs could have a safer, drier shelter than the rickety shed. The mother bear was at first wary, resisting the transition and bellowing softly whenever Josiah approached too closely. But the barn offered more space, scattered hay to lie on, and an easier way for Josiah to leave water and food without cornering them in a cramped space. Slowly, with careful patience, the bear family transferred to the barn. Josiah phoned the local wildlife ranger, seeking advice on how to proceed without harming or domesticating the creatures. Ranger Henry Watkins, an old friend of the Parker family, was stunned when he heard the story. He cautioned Josiah about the risks of interacting too closely with wild animals, especially a mother bear, but conceded that due to the exceptional circumstances, short-term care might be the only option. He offered to come by and assess whether the bear or her cubs had injuries, but stressed that they should remain as wild as possible. "We don't want them to grow dependent on humans," Henry reminded him, "but we can't let them starve either." Josiah took that advice to heart. He provided minimal but crucial support: clean water, a small supply of fruit and vegetables gleaned from leftover winter stores, and occasionally leftover scraps of cooked meat. Mostly, however, he allowed the mother bear to find her own ways around the farm's edges, letting her rummage in the orchard for fallen apples or nibble on the wild blackberries near the fence line. The cubs followed their mother, learning how to forage. Day by day, their vigor returned. Their fur gleamed as it dried, and their curious eyes began to wander, wide with the impressions of new surroundings. In that time, Josiah found his life unexpectedly revitalized. The sorrow he carried in his chest softened, if only a bit, replaced by a stirring sense of purpose. He remembered a conversation long ago with Hannah, when she had rescued a half-drowned cat from a flooded creek. She had pressed the cat against her warm coat and whispered, "We are all creatures under the same sky, Josiah. Sometimes we just need a little help to keep going." Those words resonated now more than ever. He began documenting the bear's progress in a small notebook he had once used to track seed planting. Each new milestone, like the first time he saw a cub wrestle playfully with its sibling in the barn straw, he jotted down, feeling a surprising rush of pride. He even wrote to Redwood Veterinary Clinic for advice about possible parasites or malnutrition, though he kept the question hypothetical so as not to incite alarm. The response from a kindly veterinarian named Dr. Martin included guidelines for signs to watch for and a gentle reminder that wild animals needed their space. Yet the bond forming between Josiah and the bear family was undeniable. It was a connection forged by empathy, care, and unspoken gratitude. Before long, Josiah noticed subtle changes within himself. Where before he had been content to let the days slip by in the same routine, he now sought small improvements to the farm, fixing broken fences, re-roofing the tool shed, even painting the barn doors a fresh coat of red. He spent hours outside, basking in the presence of living creatures reliant on him, restoring that sense of purpose he'd once felt with Hannah at his side. Resilience bloomed within him. The hush of heartbreak that had weighed him down for years felt less like a chain and more like a memory that spurred him toward compassion. The mother bear grew comfortable enough that on some mornings, Josiah found her dozing near the orchard, her cubs nibbling at the grass. Occasionally, if he approached from a respectful distance, he could offer a gentle wave. She would blink slowly, as if acknowledging his presence. The cubs, still skittish, sometimes stood on their hind legs, looking more curious than frightened. Buster, kept behind the farmhouse fence, barked whenever the cubs got too close, but Josiah kept them apart. Slowly, though, Buster began to relax, responding more to Josiah's calm voice and gestures than to territorial instinct. Of course, not everyone in the area viewed the situation with the same sympathetic lens. Rumors spread quickly in small towns, and Redwood Hills was no exception. One morning, a neighbor, Lorraine Benson, dropped by unannounced to pick up fresh eggs and spotted the bears behind Josiah's barn. Her shriek of alarm tore through the air, and she hastily retreated to her pickup truck, scolding Josiah for harboring dangerous wildlife. No matter how gently he tried to explain the circumstances that the mother bear had simply taken refuge from the storm, she warned him that others might not be so understanding. "Mark my words," she said, her eyes darting anxiously toward the barn. "There are folks around here who won't want bears this close." A pang of dread settled in Josiah's stomach. He had no intention of turning his farm into a permanent bear sanctuary. In fact, he knew that wasn't realistic or safe for either party. However, he felt fiercely protective of the mother bear and her cubs, a duty he couldn't shirk. He resolved to be careful, to avoid giving locals reason to panic. Over the next few weeks, he took pains to ensure that any sign of the bears was as discreet as possible. He avoided letting them wander near the road, and he limited the food he offered. Instead, he created a path toward a more wooded area on the edge of his property, hoping they would gradually move back to the wild where they belonged. As spring arrived in Redwood Hills, the landscape awakened, the orchard trees budded, and the meadows shimmered in a hue of bright, tender green. On the rare mornings when the sun broke through the clouds, Josiah noticed the cubs frolicking near the orchard edge, batting at butterflies and chasing each other around with unrestrained joy. The mother bear supervised from a short distance, seeming comfortable enough to let them explore. Every day, they ventured a bit farther from the barn, as though testing the boundaries of this strange shared territory. A pivotal moment came one crisp morning when Josiah discovered the mother bear struggling with a fishing net tangled around her forepaw. In Redwood Hills, locals sometimes use nets in the creek for catch and release fishing, and it seemed she must have encountered someone's discarded gear. The net had wrapped tight, cutting into her skin. Upon seeing Josiah approach, her instincts flared. She roared in pain and tried to back away, but the net dragged, snagging on a branch. The cubs mewed, frightened by their mother's predicament. Josiah set his jaw, a wave of concern coursing through him. He knew if she panicked, she could make the injury worse or injure him in her desperation. He moved slowly, heart pounding, voice low and calming. "Easy, girl," he murmured, inching closer, hands held up to show he carried no weapon. She huffed, eyes wild, but she recognized him. Her sides heaved with ragged breaths as she wrestled with her own dread, pinned by the net and her protective instincts. He crouched, carefully positioning himself at her flank. The mother bear did not lash out, though every tense muscle in her body prepared to do so if he hurt her or threatened her cubs. Josiah produced a small knife from his belt. He met her gaze, pausing momentarily. They shared a moment of profound understanding. With trembling fingers, he gently cut the netting piece by piece. The mother bear twitched, huffing as each cord snapped free. Finally, with one swift motion, the last of the net unraveled. She jerked away from him, eyeing him warily, but then looked down at her freed paw. She lifted it, testing. Blood trickled, but the wound didn't look dire. After a moment, she glanced at Josiah with what he could only interpret as gratitude. His chest swelled with relief, tears stinging his eyes unexpectedly. The cubs began nuzzling their mother, as if reassuring themselves that all was well. Slowly, with measured steps, the mother bear turned and limped toward the orchard. Josiah let out a long exhale. Despite the adrenaline flooding his system, a sense of calm purpose enveloped him. He had done the right thing. He had saved her from a trap not of her making. But time never stands still. The turning of spring to early summer brought new challenges. Crops needed tending, fences needed repair, and the orchard required careful pruning. The mother bear and her cubs, now healthier and stronger, ventured more frequently into the surrounding forest. At first, they continued returning to the barn for occasional shelter. Then, slowly, their visits became less frequent. Josiah felt a bittersweet ache in his heart. He knew this was the natural progression. Wild animals belonged in the wild. And yet, he couldn't deny the pang of longing as he watched their footprints fade from the mud along the orchard's perimeter. A day came when he went out to the barn to check for them, only to find it empty. The cubs' usual nest in the corner, lined with straw and old blankets, lay undisturbed. At first, he assumed they were off wandering, but by nightfall there was still no sign of them. A week passed, and though he saw glimpses of a bear shape at the edge of the woods, he wasn't certain it was the same mother and her cubs. Indeed, Redwood Hills had a modest bear population, and not every silhouette belonged to the family he had come to know. During that silent period, he found himself swallowing a lump of loneliness. He tended to Buster, repaired old tools, and listened to the haunting hush of the orchard. A few times, he even left out a dish of water or bits of food, but the offering remained untouched. As the days turned into weeks, the reality set in. The mother bear and her cubs had moved on. They had found their own path away from his humble farm. Perhaps they were forging deeper into the forest or following the creek upstream to quieter terrain. Yet life continued. Summer wore on, and the orchard bore fruit in abundance. Josiah donated extra apples and peaches to the local food pantry, recalling how he had once fed them to a hungry bear family. Sometimes he glimpsed bear tracks along the creek bed or heard rustling in the woods behind his fields, and he wondered if it was them. With time, he grew to accept their absence as a testament to the success of their healing. They no longer needed him, and that was exactly as it should be. In the quiet that followed, Josiah found the real gift left behind, a renewed sense of vitality and compassion. The sorrow he had carried for so long now wove itself into a broader tapestry of living. He tended to chores with a buoyancy he hadn't felt in years. He wrote more frequently in his grandmother's old journal, capturing reflections on life, gratitude, and the fleeting but beautiful encounters we share with others, even if they wear fur and roam free. He was more willing to greet neighbors and invite them for tea, something he had neglected since Hannah passed away. He felt, in a word, alive. Months later, the crisper air of autumn arrived, painting the leaves in bright oranges and reds. One day, while taking a load of pumpkins to the roadside stand, he decided to walk along the creek's edge. He allowed Buster to trot alongside him, the dog wagging his tail at the swirl of fallen leaves. Josiah paused at a bend in the creek where the water shimmered silver and gold under the midday sun. He remembered the mother bear's frantic struggle with the net, the terror in her eyes, and the relief when he cut her free. He closed his eyes, offering a silent wish that she and her cubs had thrived. As if in response to his silent hope, a rustling sounded from the opposite bank. He froze, scanning the undergrowth. Suddenly, a bear emerged, big and strong, looking well-fed and healthy in the early autumn light. 3 smaller bears followed. They had grown considerably, no longer tiny cubs, but not yet fully grown. Josiah's heart nearly thundered out of his chest. It could be any bear, he told himself, but a part of him recognized the set of her shoulders, the calmness in her gaze. She gazed back at him from across the creek, some 10 yards away, the water babbling between them. He lifted a hand, an instinctive greeting. The mother bear and her cubs seemed at ease, not running, not approaching, merely observing. A moment passed long enough for him to sense a gentle acknowledgement. Then she sniffed the air and ambled away into the forest, her young ones scrambling behind. Josiah stood there, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. She was alive, her cubs were strong, and they were free in the land that had always been theirs. He continued to stand at the creek for a long while, reflecting on the path life had led him on these past months. He understood that though the mother bear and her cubs would forever remain wild, their shared experience had changed them all. The boundaries between worlds had bent, if only for a season, forging a connection that would echo across redwood hills in quiet, unspoken ways. For Josiah, it was an invitation to keep living fully, opening his heart to the unexpected wonders life could bring. It was a journey of resilience, fueled by compassion and crowned by the renewal of hope. From that day forward, Farmer Josiah Parker carried in his chest the memory of a stormy night and the fragile request that transpired under a creaking shed roof. Whenever thunder rolled across the fields or a gentle rain pattered the soil, he smiled, remembering that in crisis, compassion must sometimes override fear, and in doing so, it could heal a wounded spirit on both sides of that barn door. Thank you for joining me on this heartfelt journey of a rain-soaked bear and her 3 cubs finding shelter on Farmer Josiah Parker's humble farm. Their unthinkable request for refuge and the compassion Josiah offered reminds us that hope can blossom in the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video to share the message of resilience, subscribing to the channel for more uplifting tales, and sharing it with friends or family who might need a reminder that kindness transcends barriers. Each view, comment, and share helps spread these stories and keeps our small community vibrant. Thank you for your time, your open heart, and for believing in the power of compassion. Remember that every storm eventually passes, leaving the promise of new beginnings in its wake. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay connected, and stay open to life's everyday